March 15, 1966. Paramount Studios, Burbank, California. 9 o'clock in the morning. Steve McQueen walked into conference room B wearing faded Levi's jeans, a white t-shirt, and scuffed leather boots. His hair was uncombed. He hadn't shaved in 3 days. And he was about to walk into a room with 7 studio executives who collectively controlled $400 million in annual film production, all of them wearing custom-tailored suits that cost more than most Americans made in 6 months. Robert Evans, Paramount's vice president of production, stood at the head of a polished mahogany table that stretched 14 feet across the room. Behind him, floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the studio lot where hundreds of people were already at work building sets, moving equipment, creating the dreams that made Paramount the most profitable studio in Hollywood. Evans extended his hand as Steve entered, his smile perfectly calibrated, the smile of a man who had closed 1,000 deals and never lost. "Good morning, Steve. Glad we could finally make this happen." Steve looked at the extended hand. Then he looked at the contract sitting on the table in front of the empty chair clearly meant for him. The contract was bound in black leather with gold embossing that read the Thomas Crown Affair in elegant script. Next to it sat a Mont Blanc fountain pen, positioned at the exact angle for signing. The whole setup looked like an altar, and Steve McQueen was supposed to be the sacrifice. He didn't shake Evans' hand. He walked past it and stood at the window, looking out at the lot. The other 6 executives shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. These were men who lunched with senators, who decided which stories America would see and which would die in development hell, who could make or break careers with a single phone call. And Steve McQueen had just disrespected their boss in front of all of them. Evans lowered his hand slowly, the smile tightening just slightly at the corners. "Steve, I know you've had some concerns about the contract terms, but I think you'll find we've been more than generous. $3 million. That's the biggest single-picture deal in Hollywood history. More than Brando got for the Godfather negotiations. More than Newman, more than Redford, more than anyone." Steve didn't turn around. He kept staring out the window at a crew of grips hauling cables across the lot. Regular working guys. The kind of guys Steve had been before Hollywood found him. The kind of guys Hollywood forgot existed the second the cameras stopped rolling. "You see that kid down there?" Steve said quietly. "The one carrying the cable spool? He makes $67 a week. Works 50 hours for that. You know what his name is?" Evans glanced at the other executives with an expression that said play along. "I'm afraid I don't, Steve. We employ over 2,000 people on this lot. Can't know everyone's name." "That's exactly my point, Bob." Steve turned around, and something in his eyes made the temperature in the room drop 10 degrees. "You don't know his name. You don't know anything about him. He's invisible to you. Just a body doing a job, so you can make your movies and count your money." One of the executives, a silver-haired man named Mitchell Korda, cleared his throat. "Steve, we appreciate your concern for the working man, truly we do. But we're here to discuss your contract for the Thomas Crown Affair. This is a significant opportunity. Norman Jewison directing, Faye Dunaway as your co-star. This film is going to be enormous." Steve walked slowly to the table. He stood behind the chair but didn't sit. Instead, he picked up the contract with both hands and held it up to the light streaming through the windows. The pages were thick, expensive paper. Legal language packed dense across 12 pages. All of it designed to lock Steve McQueen into making Paramount a fortune while maintaining total control over every aspect of production. He flipped through the pages slowly. The executives watched him, waiting. They'd been negotiating with Steve's agent for 3 months. 3 months of back and forth, of offers and counteroffers, of Steve making demands and the studio grudgingly meeting them. More money, better billing, approval over his wardrobe, control over his stunt work. They'd given him everything. This meeting was supposed to be a formality. Sign the contract, shake hands, take some photos for the press, and start production in 2 weeks. Steve stopped on page 7. His finger traced down the text until he found the clause he was looking for. He read it out loud, his voice flat and cold. The actor agrees that all personnel hired for personal services to the actor during production, including but not limited to drivers, assistants, trainers, and technical consultants, Must receive prior written approval from the studio. The studio reserves the right to refuse any personnel deemed unsuitable for any reason. He looked up at Robert Evans. Where's Tommy's name, Bob? The silence that followed lasted exactly 7 seconds, but it felt like 7 hours. Robert Evans's confident smile didn't waver, but his eyes hardened just slightly. He exchanged a quick glance with Mitchell Korda, then looked back at Steve with the patience of a parent dealing with a stubborn child. Steve, we've been over this. Tommy Hernandez is not a professional automotive consultant. He's a mechanic from a garage in the valley. He has no film experience, no credits, no professional standing in this industry. Steve set the contract down on the table with a deliberate slowness that made it clear he was controlling his temper by a thread. Tommy Hernandez is the best mechanic I've ever met. He knows more about cars than any of the so-called professionals you've got in your motor pool. And he's dying, Bob. Stage 4 leukemia. The doctors gave him 6 months back in October. He's got maybe 8 weeks left if he's lucky. One of the younger executives, a man named Philip Roth who'd only been promoted to the Paramount Inner Circle 6 months earlier, leaned forward. Steve, we're very sorry to hear about your friend's illness. Truly. But this is a business decision. We can't set a precedent of actors bringing in untrained personnel based on personal relationships. It opens us up to liability issues, union complications, insurance problems. Steve's jaw clenched. The muscle in his cheek twitched the same way it did in his films right before he pulled a gun. Liability issues. Is that what a dying kid's dream is to you people? A liability issue? He's not asking to direct the damn movie. He's not asking for $1 million. He just wants his name in the credits. Automotive Consultant. 6 words. That's all. Robert Evans stood up slowly, buttoning his suit jacket in a gesture that was meant to signal authority. Steve, let's take a walk. Just you and me. We can discuss this privately. But Steve didn't move. No, Bob. We discuss it right here, right now, in front of all these witnesses. Because I want everyone in this room to understand exactly what's happening. I want them to hear me say this clearly, so there's no confusion later. He picked up the contract again, holding it with both hands. 8 months ago, I met Tommy Hernandez at a garage in San Fernando Valley. I'd gone there to work on my Triumph motorcycle because I was tired of some studio mechanic treating my bike like a prop. Tommy was the kid who actually knew what he was doing. 19 years old, working 3 jobs to support his sick mother. Brilliant with engines. Could hear something wrong in a motor from across the garage. The kind of natural talent you can't teach. Steve's voice got quieter, which somehow made it more dangerous. We became friends. Every Sunday, I'd go to that garage, and we'd work on bikes together. He taught me things. Real things. Not Hollywood things. How to rebuild a carburetor. How to true a wheel. How to listen to what a machine is telling you. He never asked me for anything. Never wanted an autograph. Never wanted to meet a movie star. He just wanted to work on motorcycles with someone who loved them as much as he did. The executives sat frozen. This wasn't how these meetings went. Actors were supposed to be grateful for $3 million. They were supposed to sign the contract and say thank you. They weren't supposed to talk about dying kids and garage mechanics and make everyone in the room feel like monsters for doing business the way business had always been done. Then in October, Steve continued, Tommy collapsed at the garage. I drove him to the hospital myself. He could barely breathe. They ran tests and came back with the diagnosis. Stage 4 leukemia. Already in his bones, his organs. Too far gone for treatment to do much good. He had this look on his face when the doctor told him. Not scared. Just disappointed. Like he'd finally started to believe his life might amount to something, and then God pulled the rug out. Mitchell Korda shifted in his seat. Steve, this is very moving, but I'm not sure what it has to do with the film production contract. Steve's head snapped toward him with such sudden intensity that Korda actually flinched. It has everything to do with it, Mitch. Because when I visited Tommy in the hospital that night, when he was lying there at 19 years old processing the fact that he was going to die before he ever got to open his own shop or get married or have kids or do any of the things he dreamed about, you know what he said to me? No one answered. Steve's eyes were wet now, but his voice stayed steady. He said, Steve, guys like me, we're invisible. We work hard our whole lives and nobody ever knows our names. We're just the help. Just the guys in the background making things work so important people can do important things. Promise me something. Promise me you'll show them that guys like us matter. That we're not invisible. That we existed. Robert Evans sat back down slowly. Steve, we can't just change the entire Hollywood system because of one kid's dying wish. Steve looked at him for a long moment, then looked down at the contract in his hands. The $3 million contract. The biggest payday in Hollywood history. The contract that was supposed to make this meeting a formality. Watch me, Steve said. And then he tore it in half. The sound of tearing paper cut through the conference room like a gunshot. All 7 executives jolted in their seats as if they'd been physically struck. Steve McQueen held the 2 halves of the contract in his hands for exactly 3 seconds, letting every person in that room fully comprehend what had just happened. Then he tore it again. The halves became quarters. The leather binding split apart, the gold-embossed titles separating into meaningless fragments. He tore it a 3rd time. Quarters became eighths. Pieces of the most expensive contract in Hollywood history transformed into confetti in his calloused hands. Then Steve McQueen opened his fingers and let it fall. 12 pages of legal language, $3 million in guaranteed money, the biggest roll of the year. All of it fluttered through the air like autumn leaves and scattered across the polished mahogany table. Some pieces landed on the floor. One stuck to Mitchell Korda's coffee cup. Another landed directly in front of Robert Evans, the word, here too, visible in elegant typeface, now completely meaningless without context. Philip Roth's mouth fell open. One of the other executives, a man who'd been silent the entire meeting, whispered Jesus Christ under his breath. Robert Evans sat perfectly still, his face unreadable, but his knuckles had gone white where his hands gripped the arms of his chair. The only sound in the room was the gentle hum of the air conditioning and the distant noise of the studio lot outside the windows where hundreds of people who made $67 a week kept working, completely unaware that the entire power structure of Hollywood was cracking apart 3 floors above them. Steve McQueen straightened his spine. He looked at each executive individually, making eye contact, making sure they understood he wasn't bluffing, wasn't posturing, wasn't playing some elaborate negotiation game. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet, but it carried the weight of absolute certainty. I said no. Robert Evans found his voice first. He was Paramount's golden boy, the man who'd greenlit The Godfather and saved the studio from bankruptcy. He hadn't gotten there by backing down. Steve, that was $3 million you just destroyed. $3 million. Do you understand what you've done? Steve leaned forward, pressing his palms flat on the table. Let me tell you what I learned in reform school, Bob. I learned that power only works if you're afraid to lose. And I'm not afraid to lose anything anymore. The younger executives looked at each other nervously. This wasn't in any playbook they'd studied. Actors didn't turn down $3 million. They certainly didn't destroy contracts during negotiations. Mitchell Korda tried a different approach, his voice smooth and reasonable. Steve, let's all take a breath here. You're upset. We understand. Why don't we take a break, have some coffee, come back in an hour with clearer heads? Steve ignored him completely. He kept his eyes locked on Robert Evans. Tommy Hernandez is 19 years old. Right now, at this exact moment, he's lying in a hospital bed at Cedars-Sinai weighing 88 pounds because the cancer is eating him alive. He's got oxygen tubes in his nose and 4 lines in both arms pumping morphine into his system because the pain is so bad he can't sleep more than an hour at a time. His mother sits next to his bed 16 hours a day watching her only son die, and there's nothing she can do about it except hold his hand and pray. The room had gone completely silent. Even the air conditioning seemed to quiet down. Steve's voice got harder, colder. Tommy is a better mechanic than anyone you've got in your motor pool. He's forgotten more about engines than your professionals will ever know. But you won't give him a chance because he's not one of your Hollywood people. Because he didn't go to USC film school. Because he doesn't wear a suit and carry a briefcase. Because his last name is Hernandez instead of Harrison or Henderson or some nice safe Anglo name that makes you comfortable. Philip Roth started to interrupt, but Steve's glare cut him off instantly. I'm not finished. You want me to make your movie? Fine. I'll make your movie. I'll give you the performance of my career. I'll do every stunt myself. I'll promote it on every talk show in America. I'll make you so much money you'll choke on it. But Tommy Hernandez gets his credit. Automotive Consultant. His name goes in the opening titles, not buried in the crawl at the end. And he gets paid $500 a week for a 12-week guarantee. That's $6,000 total. Pocket change compared to what you're spending on catering. Robert Evans leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled in front of his face. And if we say no? Steve smiled, but there wasn't an ounce of warmth in it. Then I walk out of this room, and I call Hedda Hopper. I call Luella Parsons. I call every reporter and columnist and gossip writer in this town. And I tell them exactly why Steve McQueen turned down $3 million and the biggest film role of the year. Mitchell Corda's face went pale. Steve, you wouldn't.
Try me, Mitch.
I'll tell them that Paramount valued their bottom line more than a dying kid's last wish. I'll tell them you had a chance to give a 19-year-old cancer patient his one dream, and you said no because it wasn't convenient. I'll tell them that when push came to shove, Hollywood chose money over humanity. How do you think that's going to play in the press? How do you think that's going to look when every newspaper in America runs the headline, "Studio Refuses Dying Teen's Final Wish"? Robert Evans closed his eyes. When he opened them again, something had changed in his expression. He looked at his fellow executives, saw the fear in their faces, the recognition that Steve McQueen had just backed them into a corner they couldn't escape. He looked at the scattered pieces of contract on the table, $3 million in confetti. Then he looked at Steve McQueen, standing there in his jeans and t-shirt, looking more powerful than all of them combined. "Draw up the amendment," Evans said quietly. Mitchell Corda's head snapped toward Robert Evans like he'd been slapped. "Bob, you can't be serious. We can't set this precedent. If we let McQueen bring in his own people, every actor in Hollywood will start demanding the same thing." Evans held up one hand, his eyes never leaving Steve's face. "Draw up the amendment," he repeated, this time with the finality of a judge's gavel. Tommy Hernandez, Automotive Consultant. Opening credits. "Philip Roth, get legal on the phone right now." Philip fumbled for the phone on the credenza behind him, his hands shaking slightly as he dialed. The other executives sat frozen, watching their entire system of control begin to crumble. Steve McQueen hadn't moved. He stood at that table like a statue, waiting, making sure this was real and not some negotiating tactic that would evaporate the second he walked out the door. "And his salary?" Steve asked, his voice still hard. Evans looked like he'd aged 5 years in the last 5 minutes. $500 per week, 12-week guarantee, comes from the production budget, not your salary. Steve's jaw tightened. "I want it in writing by 5 o'clock today. I want the full contract, not some handshake promise that disappears in revisions. And I want to be the one who tells Tommy. Nobody else. Not some studio publicist, not some assistant."
Me.
Robert Evans nodded slowly. "You'll have it by 5. Signed by me personally." Steve held his gaze for another long moment, then turned and walked toward the door. He didn't say goodbye. He didn't shake anyone's hand. He just left, his boots echoing on the polished floor, leaving 7 of the most powerful men in Hollywood sitting in a room full of torn contract pieces wondering what the hell had just happened. The door closed behind him. For exactly 10 seconds, nobody spoke. Then Mitchell Corda exploded. "Do you realize what you just did, Bob? You just gave every actor in this town permission to dictate terms. You just handed control over to the talent." Evans stood up slowly, walking to the window where Steve had stood earlier. He looked down at the studio lot, at all those invisible people making $67 a week, and he said something that none of them expected. "Maybe it's time we did." March 15th, 1966, 7:30 in the evening. Steve McQueen drove his Ford Mustang through the streets of Los Angeles toward Cedars-Sinai Medical Center. On the passenger seat next to him sat a manila envelope containing the amended contract. He'd picked it up from Paramount at exactly 5:02, checked every page 3 times, confirmed Tommy's name was spelled correctly in the credits clause, confirmed the salary was ironclad. Robert Evans had signed it personally, just like he'd promised. Steve parked in the visitor lot and sat in his car for a full minute before going inside. His hands were shaking. They'd been shaking since he tore up that contract 8 hours ago. He'd gone home to Malibu, tried to eat something, couldn't. Tried to watch television, couldn't focus. All he could think about was Tommy lying in that hospital bed, getting weaker every day, still believing that guys like him didn't matter to people like Steve McQueen. The oncology ward on the 4th floor smelled like disinfectant and death. Steve had been here enough times in the past 5 months to know all the nurses by name. Linda was working tonight, the one who always snuck Tommy extra pudding cups even though he could barely eat. She smiled when she saw Steve coming down the hall. "He's awake. Been asking about you all day." Tommy's room was the 3rd door on the left. Steve stopped outside it, took a deep breath, and pushed it open. The kid was propped up in bed, oxygen tubes in his nose, and 4-line running into his left arm. He'd lost more weight since Steve's last visit 3 days ago. His cheekbones jutted out sharp against his skin. His arms looked like sticks. But his eyes lit up when Steve walked in, and that smile, that beautiful smile that refused to die even when everything else was dying, spread across his face. "Steve, man, I thought you forgot about me." Steve walked to the bedside and sat in the chair that had molded itself to his shape over dozens of visits. "Forget about you? Never gonna happen, kid. How you feeling?" Tommy shrugged, a gesture that took visible effort. "Same as yesterday. Same as tomorrow probably. Doctors say I should start thinking about hospice soon. Says there's nothing else they can do." Steve reached into the manila envelope and pulled out the contract. He didn't say anything. He just opened it to page 7 and pointed to line 43. Tommy squinted at it, confused at first. Then his eyes went wide. He read it once. Twice. 3 times, like he couldn't believe what he was seeing. His hand, skeletal and trembling, reached out to touch the paper like it might disappear if he wasn't careful. "That's my name," Tommy whispered. "Steve, that's my name. That's your name, kid. Automotive Consultant. Opening credits. The Thomas Crown Affair. You're going to be in a movie. A real Hollywood movie. Your name right there with mine, with Faye Dunaway's, with Norman Jewison's." Tommy's eyes filled with tears. They spilled over and ran down his hollow cheeks. "They said yes? You got them to say yes?" Steve's own eyes were wet now. He didn't try to hide it. "Damn right I got them to say yes. Wasn't even close, kid. They knew quality when I explained it to them." Tommy was crying for real now, his whole body shaking with sobs that were half joy and half the release of every moment he'd ever felt invisible. "I matter, Steve. I actually matter. My mom, she can tell people her son worked on a Hollywood movie. They'll see my name. Strangers will see my name." Steve reached out and took Tommy's hand, so thin he could feel every bone. "You always mattered, kid. From the first day I met you at that garage. You taught me more about being real than anyone in Hollywood ever could. This credit, it's not me doing you a favor. It's you doing the world a favor by letting them know you existed." Tommy gripped Steve's hand with what little strength he had left. "When do we start? When do I get to work?" Steve smiled through his tears. 2 weeks. Production starts April 1st. I'll pick you up myself, drive you to set every single day. And Tommy, I promise you this. I'm not shooting one single car scene until you approve it. Not one. You're the boss on this." They sat together in that hospital room for 2 more hours. Steve told Tommy about tearing up the $3 million contract. Tommy laughed so hard, he started coughing and couldn't stop for 5 minutes. Steve told him about the executives' faces when the paper hit the table. Tommy said that was the coolest thing he'd ever heard. They talked about motorcycles and engines and what heaven might be like if it existed. Tommy said if there's a heaven, it probably has a garage, and God probably needs a good mechanic. When Steve finally left at 10:15, Tommy was asleep with a contract lying on his chest like a blanket. Steve stopped at the nurse's station and told Linda to make sure nothing happened to that paper. She promised. Steve walked to his Mustang, sat in the driver's seat, and cried harder than he'd cried since he was a kid in reform school. But this time he was crying because something good had happened. Because power had blinked first. Because a dying kid's name was going to live forever.